Hello everyone and welcome to another video. So today I thought it would be nice to speak about the 5 books that have impacted me the most over the course of my reading and writing career. For those of you who don't know, hi, my name is Christy, I live in Japan, and I am a postgraduate student currently studying my Master of Arts Writing and Literature, and I am also an aspiring author. Naturally, I love books, and of course there have been lots and lots of books that have been massively influential to me over the course of my life. There are quite a number of books that have changed the person that I am, and those are the books I'm going to be speaking about today. Now, of course, I can't fit all of the really important books into this video, otherwise the video would be stupidly long. So today I'm going to be speaking about my top 5 most influential books, or the 5 books that have changed me the most. Book number 1. I feel like this goes without saying, like you guys know exactly which book it's going to be. If you care enough about a book to get it tattooed on your skin when you're 18, I think it's going to be a pretty important book to you. So yes, my very first book is Harry Potter. I know that this is an incredibly influential book to a lot of people. I cannot even begin to describe how influential Harry Potter has been in my life. I mean, this is the copy that I read when I was little. This edition was published in 1997, a year after I was born. This is the book that basically taught me how to read. This is the book that made me fall in love with books and magic and faraway places. This book is the reason why I wanted to be an author and I wanted to do writing. And to be entirely honest, when I was a kid, I didn't actually own a lot of books. I mean, I spent a lot of my time in libraries and I borrowed a lot of books, but in terms of what I owned, I really didn't have much. But I did have the Harry Potter books, so I religiously reread these, and I reread them over and over and over again. So this first book I've read at least 20 times, that's not exaggerating, I literally have read this over 20 times. Hermione was my biggest role model growing up, because the kids at the school I went to didn't care about their education and the teachers were incredibly apathetic. So often in my classes when I was in high school, I was the only one who really cared about doing schoolwork and like getting good grades and stuff. So I was a bit weird for being bookish and for caring about school and for spending time in the library and all of that stuff. Hermione was the only person I knew who cared about school and who cared about reading and who wanted to learn things, and I identified with her so strongly, and she was so important to me growing up as like a figure for me to look up to. Like a lot of kids, I had a really rocky time during high school. I didn't like high school very much, so whenever I was really struggling with things, whenever I had a hard time, I would just read Harry Potter. My love for Harry Potter is such a personal thing and it's so important to me, and I just care about this book and this book series so much, hence why I have the tattoo on my arm. This says always. It is a quote from the 552nd page of Deathly Hallows. This quote basically represents how this book is always going to be the most important book to me. It's always going to be the thing that started my want to be an author. It's always going to be, this really, really important part of my childhood. Okay, emotional talking about it. That's so silly, I'm so sorry. Anyway, this is the most influential book for me by far. If ever I get asked what is my favorite book, Harry Potter is always the front runner. It's the least literary book on this list, but it is the most important and it is the most influential. Now that I've spent half an hour talking about Harry Potter, I'm gonna have to cut out so much of that footage. I can now breeze through the rest of the books on this list. So the second most influential book to me is Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This is the very first literary novel that I ever read. As I said before, I went to a high school that was in a low socioeconomic area. The kids didn't care, the teachers didn't care. My English classes were just a complete joke. We didn't do anything. But when I was 16, I moved to a new school, which I really, really liked. But the very first book we had to read was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And it was the first time I'd ever read anything that wasn't like a YA novel or a kid's book. So when I picked it up and I had heard a little bit about the story, and I thought it was going to be really, really boring and stuff because I didn't know yet that I loved literature. But I read it and it was just freaking poetry. It was so good. I'm sorry if I get any of the details wrong. It's been a really, really long time since I've read this book. But basically the book is set in a psychiatric ward in the 1960s It is second person narration. It's narrated by a half Native American man named Chief about a man named McMurphy who pretends to be insane to get out of a prison sentence and basically enters the psychiatric ward, and the way his presence conflicts with like the regimes of institutionalization and the power structures that are already there. The book is incredibly problematic. If you analyze it with a modern gaze, it's so offensive. But when I analyzed this book for my essay, I had so much fun. I just loved it. It was kind of the moment when I realized that like this is like the thing I'm good at, like this is what I really, really love. And basically this book is the reason why I started looking at doing English at university, and I ended up doing a marketing degree because it's more practical, but I still like did heaps of English topics, and I'm still doing my master's in English, so this book was really, really influential to that. I don't love the book in and of itself, like it's not one of my favorite books, but it was just such an influential book for me to read at 16 years old because it just opened my world to literature, basically. The third book on this list is Angela Carter's The Magic Toy Shop. This is, I think, basically my second favorite book of all time. Like, if we completely discount Harry Potter, I adore this book. Angela Carter is basically my idol. She's the coolest person in the entire world, and I love everything about her, and I love everything about this book. Basically, the plot of this book is there is a young girl named Melanie whose parents die in a horrible accident, and she is sent to live with her aunt and her uncle in this creepy magic toy shop in London. Now, the toy shop isn't actually magic at all. This isn't like a fantasy novel. It's a gothic novel, but the toy shop is very, very creepy, and there's a certain amount of magic in this book, which I really, really like. Her uncle is this like grotesque, awful human being, and he's just the most oppressive and nasty person. His wife is mute, she doesn't talk, but she's quite kind and gentle with like the kids, and Melanie's younger siblings get taken to this home as well. Basically how she deals with being taken out of her home in the countryside, how she deals with her childhood ending so abruptly at the death of her parents. I read this in the second year of my undergraduate degree, and I absolutely just fell in love with it. The style of this book is insane. The way it's written, the use of technique, the allegory, the way that Melanie is just developed throughout the novel is just absolutely beautiful. Although I can't really pick out any one particular thing that makes this book really, really influential to me. This is just basically like the beacon of what I aspire to one day writing. Like, I like to write fantasy stuff. I like to write stuff that's a little bit more magical than this, but I just adore this book so, so much. Basically, this is the book that made me really, really love like the gothic genre. Stylistically, this is a very unique book, and I just found it really, really important to me. The fourth book on this list isn't even a book at all, although I have it in a book. It is The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. I discovered Prufrock when I was in my final year of high school. It was one of our set texts for our poetry unit. I just absolutely fell in love with this poem. Now, Prufrock is a modernist poem, obviously by T.S. Eliot. Can't even say it's like, oh, it's poetry, because like literally it is poetry, but it is a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing. It's like 131 lines long, I think. I've memorized all of those lines word for word. It's really, really difficult to describe this poem and give it justice. Like, I don't want to be like, here is the characterization and here is the plot, because that's not the way a poem works. But Prufrock is basically about this guy who struggles to seize the day, basically. He lives in this sort of like fear of doing things and fear of like screwing things up. The main narrator of this poem seems to be this complete socially anxious dweeb, and I love it so much. Reading this poem in year 12 was the thing that 100% cemented that I wanted to go to university to study literature, and it was just the most eye-opening thing, because it really showed me that a poem to be literary doesn't need to be regimented and very structural. It doesn't have to be something specific or outlined or old. Like, a poem can be fluid and modern and beautiful and sprawling and all over the place, and it's just... Prufrock is a very, very cool poem, and I definitely recommend you guys going and looking it up if you haven't read it before. Book number 5 is also not really one book, but really just like the entire works of Virginia Woolf. Particularly Mrs. Dalloway, because Mrs. Dalloway was the very first book I read by Virginia Woolf, which I read in my very first course in university. Mrs. Dalloway is just this absolutely amazing novel. the whole thing, the book is like this thick. I don't have my copy of the book here in Japan with me because it's back home in Australia. It's like this thick, the book, and there are no chapters. The entire book is just one wall of text. And the entire thing is set in one day, and it is stream of consciousness, and it hops in between the consciousnesses of different people. But if you read it really, really slowly and you take in everything and you concentrate while reading it, it's just this absolute masterpiece. It's so beautifully written and it's so amazing, and I loved it so much. But yeah, after reading Mrs. Dalloway, I read A Room of One's Own, I read Orlando, I read To the Lighthouse. All of these books are just absolute genius. I think Virginia Woolf is probably one of the best, if not the best, writers of the modern period. Reading Mrs. Dalloway was an immensely influential book to me because I read it in my very first year of university. I read it Great Expectations and I didn't like it very much. I read The Turn of the Screw and that was slightly better, but I still didn't like it very much. And then I read Mrs. Dalloway and I was like, yes, this is why I'm studying English. And yeah, her works have been very, very influential to me because I've spent a long time studying them. I've taken every opportunity to write critical essays on Virginia Woolf. And yeah, her works are just basically really, really influential to me because she's taught me so much about the magic of writing and the magic of literature and what can be done with words. It's just, her stories and her books are just so amazing and I just love them so, so much. And those are all the books / authors that have been the most influential to me over the course of my reading and writing so far. Please let me know what books have been really influential to you, what books you love, what books made you discover the magic of reading. I hope you enjoyed the video and have a lovely day. Bye.